LaMia 2933 was doomed the moment she rolled out onto the runway. And it's not because there was a malfunction. There was no accidental operational error committed by anyone. There wasn't an engine that stopped working. Nothing was physically wrong with Flight 2933. So why then did she go nose first into the side of a mountain? The reason is simpler than you can even begin to imagine, and that egregious overestimation based on greed and a complete disregard for the rules would put 77 people, which included an entire football team, in an unstoppable freefall in the blink of an eye. What do you think happens to an Avro RJ85 streaking nose first into a rocky hillside? And who was to blame for this awful negligence? Well, we're about to find out. Let's start this terrible tragedy at the very beginning. This is the story of LaMia 2933. You see, Flight 2933 was transporting a Brazilian soccer team by the name of Associação Chapecoense de Futebol. Besides the 22 players, they also brought along the team's 23 staff members, 5 guests that were traveling with the players, and 21 journalists that were covering the Copa Sudamericana football competition that the team was heading to the Final Four. This is no small championship. Most of South America takes part in it, and it's a highly publicized event. It's not completely certain why LaMia was transporting the team, but it can only be assumed that they sponsored some of the flights for the league's teams, because LaMia is owned by a Bolivian company, and the team was from Brazil. LaMia doesn't exactly have the best track record when it comes to safety procedures, so it's unlikely that they were the sole sponsors for the event, and Chapecoense just happened to be placed with them to attend the final. Where this arrangement becomes tricky is when agreements between countries and the aircraft traveling between them come into question. The Brazilian team was supposed to fly from Brazil to Colombia, but the request to book that flight was denied. LaMia was based in Bolivia, but according to Brazilian laws, a charter flight can only fly to or from its country of origin. Charter flights cannot operate in foreign countries unless its own country is on its designated flight plan. So they took the slightly longer route from Bolivia to Colombia that was allowed. The team took a charter flight to Bolivia, swapped over to Flight 2933 and got ready to fly to Colombia from there. Like we mentioned, LaMia has a bad history when it comes to planning, organization, and their adherence to safety procedures. This complicated set of flight changes and planning was already rushed. They had a deal with a very successful and well-known football team that was partaking in a major multi-country competition. And they weren't going to miss out on being featured as a sponsor just because of some pesky laws. All in all, the plane held 77 people, and it was captained by 36-year-old Miguel Alejandro Quiroga Murakami. He joined LaMia in 2013, and at the time of the accident, he was one of the airline's co-owners as well as a flight instructor. Quiroga also had a background in flying for the Air Force, so he was pretty experienced as a flyer who could handle stressful situations. He logged a total of 6,692 flight hours, including 3,417 hours on the Avro RJ85. Since Quiroga partially owned LaMia, he had stakes in this flight going well, and he was definitely very aware of the fact that there were members of the press on board. LaMia needed to look good and operate without delays or hiccups. The first officer was 47-year-old Fernando Goitia. He received his type rating on the Avro RJ85 just 5 months before the accident and had a total of 6,923 flight hours, with 1,474 of them on the Avro RJ85. Goitia had a relatively unremarkable record, and he seemed to be shaping up to be a very capable flyer. At least he had no bias to make this a picture-perfect flight like the captain did. Cici Arias, a trainee pilot, was also present in the cockpit, but she was only there in an observational role and not in any way involved in any decision-making or in any sort of operational capacity. And we need to make one more mention, and that is the very ominous dream that Helio Hermito Zampia Neto, defender of Chapecoense, had the night before departure. He dreamt that he was on that plane, that it was raining outside, and that there was a flash and a drop in his stomach before he found himself amongst the trees in the dead of the night. The dream frightened him so much that he asked his wife to pray for him while he was traveling, sure that God himself had sent him a warning of things to come. Neto, however, convinced himself that it was just flying jitters and reluctantly got on that flight despite his unease. On November 28, 2016, the team and crew departed from Vero Vero International Airport in Santa Cruz, Bolivia at 18:18. Before takeoff, they'd filled up the tanks with exactly 20,002 pounds of fuel on board. When the entire flight path was taken into account, it would take them a calculated 19,525 pounds of fuel to fly from Bolivia to Medellin, Colombia. If you'll notice, that's a very tight margin of fuel for the entire flight to work with. Just a little over 400 pounds would be left once they landed in Colombia. They could have fueled up a little more to fill the tanks completely, but the football team had a large amount of luggage and equipment going with them, and the reporters had their own cameras, tripods and whatnot to weigh the plane down even more than its standard. So the decision was made to not fill the tanks up to the brim to make room for the extra luggage. Normally, any fool would realize that it's too risky to take on a flight with such a small margin of fuel at its disposal. So, arrangements were made to refuel at Cobija, Captain Anibal Arab Airport that sits right on the Bolivia-Brazil border. Now, Cobija Airport does not operate 24/7. They close late afternoon and open early in the morning. They don't accept flights after working hours, so there would be no staff to receive them. Flight 2933 was going to make their refueling stop just in time before the airport shuts its doors for the evening. Unfortunately, just before takeoff, one of the players, Anil Rochelle, who plays left-back position, asked staff to retrieve a video game that he'd accidentally left in his luggage that was now already stored in the plane's cargo hold. Since this was a chartered flight, the captain had room to delay takeoff so that the crew could find the game. Predictably, going through all of the luggage took so long that by the time they took off, the airport where they would stop to refuel had already closed for the day. But since they technically had enough fuel, by a hair mind you, to make the entire flight, the captain decided to go ahead and fly straight through to their destination in Medellin, Colombia, without refueling at the halfway mark. The final straw came to the plane itself and the amount of luggage that was on it. The Avro RJ85 is probably not a model you've heard of before, because they're not really a very popular choice of passenger plane. It's much smaller than passenger planes usually are, holding only 112 passengers at the time. So it's usually reserved for charter flights. Its T-tip tail and higher set wings are an unusual design too. A design that requires a little more fuel than average to run than a plane this size usually would. It's only by a fraction more, but a fraction is all it takes to take a flight to the edge of disaster when you're only running on about 400 pounds of leftover fuel. Captain Quiroga put in the request to change the flight plan for a straight flight, but was promptly denied. Controls stated that the fuel to distance travel ratio was just too tight to make a straight flight, which is perfectly reasonable for them. After all, any passenger plane needs to have at least an hour's worth of excess fuel after landing. Flying with less than that is illegal. But Quiroga was insistent. He kept requesting the flight path to be changed and was denied several times, until he finally reached a more inexperienced flight officer at control who gave him the green light. Quiroga had at least 3 denials from control and full knowledge that it was highly illegal to fly the path with the amount of fuel he had. Yet he continued to push for clearance until he got lucky. When they took off from Vero Vero International Airport in Santa Cruz, Bolivia at 22:18 UTC, Flight 2933 was officially flying illegally, and Quiroga knew it. Before we get to their travels in the air and the expected disastrous end that 2033 would come to, we need to defend the player who'd asked for his game console. Alan Russell had no idea that they were on a tight schedule. He wasn't throwing a hissy fit to get a silly little game. Alan had been traveling all day, and he simply and very calmly asked staff if it was possible to get the game. The choice to delay the flight had nothing to do with the celebrity's demands. No, this was entirely the captain's call. He could have denied the request and done this by the book. His rank demands that he make sober decisions with the safety of his passengers in mind. But the presence of all those reporters made him bend the rules so that the airline, which already had a bad reputation for exactly this kind of behavior, could look as good as possible in the papers. Alan could not possibly have known what was going on in the background, and the series of events is not because of his request. We need to make that crystal clear before moving on. Then we need to take into account that Quiroga co-owned the airline, and the officer who finally gave him clearance was a junior officer who was undoubtedly intimidated by the fact that her boss was pushing for an illegal flight. With all of that said, let's take you through the flight. Take a deep breath. If you were annoyed with the decisions made up to this point, you're about to blow your top with anger when you hear what absolutely irresponsible decisions were going to be made. On the afternoon of the 28th of November, after the team took a picture with the pilots and crew, Flight 2933 finally took off. Everyone was in good spirits and most of the passengers were getting ready to catch a little sleep or to chat with their neighbors. There's nothing of note to mention about their climb into the air. Captain Quiroga took off just as he should have, and the flight was completely unremarkable at first. It's around 3 hours into their flight, at 21:16, that the first worrisome sign began to show. According to the aeroplane's data, this is when the fuel light came on. When it blinked on in the cockpit, recording stopped running completely. There are two reasons that this could have happened. First, there could have been a malfunction, but no signs of that were later picked up in the wreckage to indicate that the system was malfunctioning. Or secondly, Quiroga manually disengaged the system to intentionally have no record of the pilot's conversation in the air. Most passenger planes won't allow this to happen, but the Avro RJ85 has a switch right on the dashboard, so it would have been easy. They were only 77 miles away from El Dorado Airport in Bogota, Colombia. Had they put in a request for fuel then, they would have been accommodated without hesitation. But in doing so, Quiroga risked the fact that he was now flying illegally from being discovered. So he made the decision to not divert the plane to Bogota, instead heading for their destination in Medellin, which was still 180 nautical miles away. According to their fuel levels on the dashboard, they still had 23 minutes left before they ran out completely. But flying the 180 miles to Medellin takes about 50 minutes. If you've been following us so far, the math ain't mathing over here, and Quiroga was well aware of this. But he relied on the fact that planes are intentionally calibrated to overestimate fuel usage, and you usually get a few extra minutes of air even if the tanks read that they're empty. At 9:30 they began their slow descent, preparing to land in Medellin. Once the descent is initiated, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes before the tires hit the tarmac, but they only had 14 minutes of fly time left. On top of this obvious time constraint, they just entered a thick fog bank. That included rain and wind. The weather was turning for the worst. Quiroga notified Medellin that they were starting their descent, but Jose Maria Cordova International Airport in Medellin told him to do a holding loop for the time being. They just gotten a mayday call from another aircraft that was making an emergency landing because it had a fuel leak. Again, Quiroga did not notify the airport that he was running on empty, and it's not like the airport had any idea what his fuel levels were. So they put the aircraft that was in distress at the highest priority for landing. At roughly 9:40, Quiroga made one loop over the Cerro Gordo mountain range just outside Medellin and requested to land again. The dashboard now read that their tanks were completely empty, and he was literally running on fumes now. But still, Quiroga said nothing to Control about the fuel situation. Control told him that the emergency landing of the plane in trouble had completed, but there were two other planes doing loops to accommodate its landing too. Once they finished their landings, Flight 2933 would have its turn to land. Quiroga needed to do one more loop, giving them 10 minutes to clear the runway for them. 2933 went into its second loop, already 18 minutes past the time that they ran out of fuel. Quiroga was right about one thing at least. Those fumes did buy you a few minutes after all, but that gifted time was about to run out. At 9:53, engines 3 and 4 on the right wing flamed out, followed by engines 1 and 2 on the left wing at 9:55. Keep in mind, even though the plane was plunged into complete darkness and all of the engines are dead, their dashboard and radios are still working. But Quiroga waits 3 minutes before calling it in. He announces to a startled control team that he's had complete engine and electrical failure at 9:58. He manages to tell them that they're 9 miles away from the runway and that they're at an altitude of 9,000 feet, 1,000 feet less than they should be during a loop. So whatever Quiroga did in those 3 minutes between complete failure and calling it in had cost them precious height. We can't know what was happening or what was said during 29:33's final minutes, because the pilots never turned on the cockpit recordings. But as we learned from the crash site later, chances are that no one on board, neither passengers nor crew members, were informed about just how serious their predicament was.
Señorita, Lima India 2933 está en falla total, eléctrica total y combustible. Está libre de operable lluvia sobre la estación Lima India 933, bomberos alertados.
And then control loses all radar signals from 2933. They've dropped off completely. They now only have radio communication left to rely on. And then radio communication goes dead too. Flight 2933 was last known to be somewhere over the Cerro Gordo Mountains. The alert was immediately put out, but heavy fog prevented helicopters from getting any visuals of the already challenging terrain below. Given that 2933's signal went dead above the mountain range and that they hadn't been spotted on any radar or on radio since 2200, that evening, the assumption was that they went down somewhere along those heavily forested peaks. Under pitch darkness, complicated by extreme fog, thick tree canopies and no signals to go off of, the all-night search was predictably extremely time-consuming. It wouldn't be until the next morning at 3:10 a.m. when rescuers finally catch sight of wreckage on the side of one of the peaks, and another hour before they could physically reach the site. 2933 had hit the peak and skidded down 140 feet, splintering into several pieces as if careened down, leaving the bodies of passengers in its wake, indicating that almost no one had their safety belts on at the time of impact. This would further show that the pilots weren't communicating with the passengers. Not only had none of them implemented any preparations for a crash landing, they should have had their seatbelts on during descent for a normal landing anyway. Most likely the pilots were so preoccupied with their predicament that they didn't even notify anyone that they were approaching the airport to land. They were only 9 miles away from the runway. At this point, even the stewardesses should have been buckled in. Initially, emergency services found 8 survivors, but one individual died on the helicopter as they were heading out of the gorge, and another died sometime later in the hospital, bringing the survivor count down to 6. Alan Russell, the defender, who requested that his gaming console be brought to him, also survived. And even though he sustained a serious back injury that required 2 major surgeries and suffered extreme PTSD and survivor's guilt after the crash, went back to the field and is still playing the game he loves to this very day. Jackson Foreman, the goalkeeper of the team, lost his left leg and spent years recovering from his multiple injuries, but has made a full recovery. Helio Hermito Zampier Neto, another defender, and Milton Willibaldo dos Santos, a Chapecoense staff member, also made it out alive, despite their extensive injuries, that is. And finally, there was Erwin Tumuri, the flight technician on board, whose extraction was caught on camera. He managed to lessen his injuries but curled his body up into a ball right before impact. Needless to say, the football world was thrown into a deep despair, and moments of silence were held at every game in the following weeks. Crowds gathered to light candles and vigils were held across South America. The survivors' accounts confirmed the investigation's findings. According to the passengers, one moment all was well, and the next the lights all went out. The stewardesses were confused and told the passengers to buckle up when they felt the plane start to drop. But most of the passengers didn't even have time to do so before they hit the mountain. And there was no announcement from the captain over the speakers to indicate that anything was out of the ordinary. Needless to say, this was a remarkable short investigation. The black box, records from the airport and their own fuel readings Captain Quiroga's repeated denials to change the flight plan when he knew full and well that they were going to be flying illegally, and the passengers' accounts. Well, there was no denying that this crash was the result of gross negligence by the captain and co-owner of LaMia, and the airline's negligent actions in general. This opened the floodgates for a slew of investigations and eventual convictions of many employees and owners of the airline. LaMia was already under suspicion for bending the rules before the crash of 2933, and when the true scope of their disregard for the rules finally came to light, everyone was stunned that there hadn't been more fatalities in the past. Flying with less fuel reserves than was legally required was a habit that LaMia liked to push. It was found that 3 of their scheduled flights in the month leading up to the crash also flew without the appropriate amount of fuel. All in all, they found no less than 23 flights that were guilty of doing this. Honestly, the amount of criminal charges against LaMia and all its owners and employees are too many to list. They gambled with more lives in the year preceding the tragic end of Flight 2933 than any other airline that we've covered on this channel. The operator who cleared the captain's request for the flight path change fled the country, but was eventually found and tried. Another co-owner of the airline also fled, and it took 5 years before they found her and finally got to bring her to justice. New cases are still being brought forth to this very day, and it goes without saying that LaMia is no longer operational, nor will that name ever stain the skies again. What happened to the Chapecoense team and the world of football was a tragedy, and LaMia is an absolute disgrace to the world of aviation. The company spent years bending the rules, and when their sins finally caught up to them, it cost the lives of 71 people who all deserve to feel the sun on their skin for many more years to come. But greed and the chase for clout on the backs of high-value clientele was apparently enough reason to disregard the rules completely and to put innocent lives on the line. This might be the worst case of negligence we've ever covered on this channel. We don't know about you, but the horrific management of LaMia is what our nightmares are made of.